Hi, everybody, and welcome to Meet the Experts series. This is our next installment. I'd like to first introduce myself. My name is Chael Banks. I manage our professional services teams here at Okta, the teams that are responsible for implementing Okta technology and pushing you down the path to time to value and receiving value from the technology that you buy. First, at the bottom of your screen, you'll see some icons that you can use to interact with the team, ask questions, look at some of the bios that are out there as well. So feel free, even while this is going on, you can submit questions. And by the way, some questions have been submitted previously. If you have questions that have been submitted and we don't answer those, we're happy to answer those in email as well. Moving right in, safe harbor statement's pretty traditional. I think the way that I read this is we're providing some advice and answers to questions. It's our opinion, but no promises for futures. If in the recording, feel free to read through this. I won't take you through the pain of doing that myself. I'd like to introduce the panel. We'll start with Praveen. So Praveen, please take some time and introduce yourself.
Hello, everyone. This is Praveen Atluri. I'm the Principal Technical Consultant at Okta, and I have 15 years of experience in information technology and in various domains like identity, integration, DevOps, and software development background. And I'm primarily focused on working with Okta customers closely during the design and implementation of Okta. Thank you.
Thank you, Praveen. Joe, you're up next.
Oh, hello, everyone. My name is Joe Witt. I'm a senior services architect at Okta. Been with Okta for 3 years, with 20 plus years in information technology. Played all different roles, from developer to managing development teams to architecture, pretty much everything. And most of the focus has been in identity and access management through most of my career. So my primary goal is helping Okta customers to utilize Okta technology, solving challenging identity aspects. Thank you, everyone.
And that you do. Thank you, Joe. Batting cleanup, sports analogy, because we don't have any sports these days. Damien.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Damien Harden. I'm a senior technical consultant based in Melbourne, working for the APAC region. I've been doing IT for 15 years in integration, software development, and for the last decade or more in identity. I've got a pretty broad background in all sorts of identity products, Sun, Oracle, the works. I've been at Okta for a year, and I'm typically involved in a lot of SCIM projects and bespoke solutions. So I'm really enjoying it so far. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, gentlemen. We will dive right into the questions from here. So first question, how can I best use Okta for authentication with CLI tools and integrations, or in scenarios where a browser is not available for interactive login?
So I'll start with that one. Obviously CLI tools and those types of applications typically, don't involve a browser, right? You're either doing something command line, or maybe it's even a smart TV or something that just doesn't have the facilities to handle what you typically see from a modern auth experience. And so, Okta provides different ways that you can handle that. Going directly to the Okta APIs. So you basically call username, password, and say, is that successful? Great. If it is, then you can say this is a valid user. And then there's other approaches too that take the more traditional OAuth approach, which provides a slightly different experience for those YouTubers out there. If you've ever seen how YouTube works, it basically gives you a link and says, here's a code, go and type this code in. And then you would do that on your smart device. And then that basically triggers an OAuth flow. And the CLI tool, or maybe the smart TV, is sort of polling, waiting for the response. And once it receives it, then that user can be considered a authenticated user, and then you can provide that level of access that you would require within those tools. And so Okta supports that again through APIs or through the OAuth approach.
So I'm going to interpret the question a little bit differently. For me, I'm thinking about when you have command line tools and you use the Okta APIs to do admin functions. So typically what we do for that kind of scenario is you have an API token which is bound to a service account with certain permissions, and you put that token in an environment variable to keep it relatively out of the command line history. And then you can use our SDKs to call our APIs behind the scenes. There is a new feature that's come out recently, and it's expanding, which is OAuth for Okta, where you can actually use just standard OAuth to get scopes to perform those actions. And that's just a more granular way. So I guess looking at this question, if you're thinking about building command line tools or doing integrations that call our APIs, it's worth considering that new functionality, OAuth for Okta, as opposed to API tokens.
No, that's great. I do love this series because every question I end up learning more.
Yeah.
Probably didn't admit that, but it's true. Those are the experts. I love this. Thank you, Damien. I appreciate it. Next question. What are some Okta Power User Pro tips for deployments in terms of efficiency and performance regarding customized configurations?
Sure. So if there are multiple Okta orgs, Terraform can be used to provision the admin user accounts and assign the admin roles to the specific users. And if the Okta environment already has an Active Directory or existing SSO solution integrated, then admin users can be provisioned through AD, LDAP, or through inbound federation. And group rules can be leveraged to assign the admin roles to the users.
So some tips I would give is always limit the number of super admins or any kind of admin that you have with your Okta orgs. So some customers get really excited when they get that first email from Okta saying, welcome to Okta. And they go and give out links to all their buddies and all their friends in different departments and say, yeah, you can be an admin too. And then they forget about it by the time they go to production. So I typically like to poke around and say, why are there 10 super admins in production? Another thing I like to do as well is to have a distinct service accounts for things like logging, integration, things like your API integration, so that you can actually identify those individual calls and services and know where the calls are coming from. And also, I guess if you're doing onboarding of a large number of users, don't forget that we actually do support password hash imports for a large number of hashing algorithms. So in a lot of cases, you don't have to go through a full reset of all your users. You can use that capability. And we also have the password import hooks now as well, which allow us to call out to other systems and then actually check if a password or user entered is correct and just onboard them that way. So it's a lot less painless now to actually bring large volumes of users in.
Yeah, and I'll add for this particular question, we sort of talked about it previously, but OAuth for Okta APIs, right? That sort of takes away the requirements of that API token and allows you to be a little bit more granular in terms of what scopes and provisions you want to use for your users in terms of performing actions specifically within Okta, such as creating apps or other things that you do on a day-to-day basis instead of doing it manually through a Terraform or a different tool like that.
That's great. Yes, thank you very much. Next question, how can I customize Okta's login experience?
Yeah, so there are different ways to customize the Okta's login experience. One way is to modify the Okta hosted login widget, and that can be customized by configuring the vanity URL in Okta. And customers, I worked with some customers who hosted their own version of Okta login widget and integrate with Okta. I mean, if there is a OIDC application, customers can directly integrate with Okta using and host their own version of login widget. And I have also worked with one of the largest healthcare customers that wants to keep their existing login pages, as they don't want to go through any of the approval processes with their business team. And when migrating to Okta, they have leveraged our Okta auth.js library and integrated their existing login pages with Okta.
Yeah, so I think a lot of customers think that Okta sign-in widget is just, how hard is it to make your own? It's just a username, password field. It can't be that hard, right? And they don't realize that it's been, battle tested against a whole bunch of browsers, for use on mobile devices. And somewhere where it really shone for me with a customer was we had a university over in Australia, and they obviously have very strict requirements around accessibility and, you know, catering to, for example, vision impaired users. And Okta has a lot of that just baked in, right? So they've already considered those kind of use cases and built that in. And if you're a customer who's thinking, you know, let's just build a custom login page, you do need to think about the resources that you have to kind of get that same level of compatibility across browsers and, you know, coverage for things like accessibility. So it's, you get all that goodness, and I've seen some really great customizations with, you know, CSS and a bit of JavaScript, and you wouldn't know you're looking at that standard Okta sign-in widget. So just before, I'd say to any customer, usually our recommendation is consider using the sign-in widget and customizing it before you go down the path of building your own. There's usually has to be a specific case for that.
I'll ditto Damien's comments on that one, because anytime that I'm in with the customer and specifically around that login experience, you know, it's always sort of a 4-layer topic that I have. It's, you know, one, default login page, if that's what you can live with, right? And then the next one is the Okta hosted widget, right? Because you can pretty much skin it and do what you need to make it look and feel like it's yours. And then the third one is actually hosting the widget yourself, right? So you're actually deploying that. And then the final option, and the one that I highly don't recommend, is going directly to the APIs, because there is a lot more than just a user typing in their username and password, right? There's password reset, expired password. And then the complexities even get more when you start to talk about MFA and factor enrollment and factors, and how do you handle each one of those. And the widget is designed to handle all those for you, so you don't have to go through that a massive amount of coding.
That's great, guys. It shows the depth of product versus, it's a build versus buy, right? So shows you the depth of functionality. Damien, I love the clarification around understand your requirements first, because a lot of that's been thought through. We have thousands and thousands of customers that their feedback has been heard and built into the product. So if you just sort of move away from the further you move away from the product, the more difficult it can be to.
Yeah, when we kick off an engagement, we typically show them a few pages that use the actual Okta sign-in widget that are not custom, and the customers are amazed, like, oh, that's the sign-in widget. We're like, yes, that is the sign-in widget. You just don't know what you can do with the sign-in widget in terms of customization.
That's fantastic, you guys. Thank you. Next question. What can you do and not do with Terraform?
I'll start. So the Okta provider for Terraform is basically built on top of the Okta's admin APIs. So under the covers, it's just essentially calling our APIs to determine the state of that Okta org remotely and how it's being configured, and reconcile that against the config. So if there's part of the, if there's an Okta admin API that doesn't exist to configure a certain part of Okta, then it's not going to be available via Terraform. So for example, at the moment, you can't do things like configure AD or LDAP agents with Terraform. You can't do things like turn on threat insight with Terraform. So typically when I'm working with a customer and they use Terraform, I'll put pages in their Confluence and say, okay, before Terraform, do these steps, then do Terraform, which is about 80% of your configuration automated, and then do the remaining 20%, which is turn on threat insight, you know, turn on that flag, turn on that flag. And that's usually a pretty acceptable compromise because you get a lot of automation. So it can do a lot, like you can do all your policies, you can do your identity providers, you can do your auth servers, scopes, claims, etc. And I think just one thing I want to say is, if you've already got an org and it's already built and you've got lots of configuration, it is still possible to bring it back into Terraform. So Terraform does offer an import feature, so you can bring your config back. In a lot of cases, when you have some orgs, for example, I've got a customer where we're spinning up at the moment with Terraform, they're going to eventually have 17 orgs. The benefits are going to be there for them to actually pull that config in and then roll that out and manage that over time. Praveen, have you had any customers use Terraform?
Yes, so I have worked with few customers, and so the largest customer that I worked with, they have around 30 Okta orgs, and they have automated everything using Terraform. And all the features, like all the OIDC apps and SAML apps, all the configurations like authorization server configurations, password policies, authentication policies, everything can be automated through Terraform. And we also have a custom provider for ASA as well. And even all the ASA settings can be automated through Terraform.
Cool.
Good. Again, I'm learning. Thank you. Next question is there any documentation around editing login pages, error pages, and email templates?
So I'll take that one, or at least I'll start taking that one. So yes, of course, there's documentation around how to edit the login pages, error pages, and email templates. Most of that can be found on developer.okta.com, which is always the recommended place to go when you want to start looking for information, especially on how to develop on the Okta platform. So I always recommend that, if you're looking for something, start there. And like anything, our developer.okta is open, and obviously it's crawled by web search engine. So a lot of times you can even just do Google search and find information on how do I customize a login page on Okta, or how can I set up an email template and what variables are allowed. And you can find a lot of that information just by doing Google search as well. One of the things that obviously recommend around when you start to develop login pages or error pages, is engaging professional services to help, because obviously we have a lot of experience in what works and what doesn't work. And of course, there isn't one right way to do everything. And so having that experience is definitely beneficial as well.
A couple of tips I'll add is if you are going to customize the Okta hosted login page, don't forget that there is actually a default page. You can put /login/default on the end of your org, and that will bypass any of your customizations. And that's really handy if you've put some JavaScript in as part of trying to customize and you've essentially locked yourself out by customizing that page. And going back to Joe's point about Google, if you get stuck, just Google Okta default login page, and you should hit the page which says add /login/default, and that way you'll be able to get back into your org again. I've done it to myself, so that's when I learned about that in the early days. And also, if you're editing email templates, be aware that Okta does sanitize a number of different aspects of HTML. So, for example, if Okta sees a script tag in your HTML, it will kick it out. I had a customer wanting to do certain Gmail specific HTML, and they couldn't see it coming through when they were testing it. And when we looked under the covers, we could see that Okta was actually sanitizing that because it wasn't standard, or it didn't fit with what Okta considered to be, I guess, safe HTML. So there is actually a button that you can get turned on in your Okta orgs. I believe it's turned on in new orgs by default, which is the send test email button, which is really handy. So when you're looking at an email template, yes, you can see what it would look like through the admin UI in your browser, but then you can click that send test email button and it will send the email to yourself without you having to, for example, reset your password or activate an account. You'll just get a test email sent to yourself. And then you could, for example, open it up in your mobile device, open it up in your desktop email client and see what it looks like without having to go through the rigmarole of actually doing the action associated with the email. So that's a pretty handy button to have.
And I would like to add one more thing. So there is a good documentation in GitHub, Okta GitHub. So you can go there, go through the README file and look at all the configs that are offered by Okta, and you can play with that. And there are also some samples in Okta GitHub that you can leverage.
Great. Thanks, Praveen. Thanks, everybody. Oh, why are we not moving forward here? There we go. Sorry about that. This is a mouthful. Any enhancements on SCIM provisioning to make it admin friendly for configuring and enabling LCM and APIs?
So I'll start with that one. With any type of integration component like SCIM, it's not always call it the straightforward where, oh, let me just call an API and make things happen. SCIM in particular, when you set that up on any Okta app for SCIM provisioning, you'll find that Okta does a few things prior to actually turning it on. It just sort of does some sanity checks to make sure, can you connect to this service? Is the account that you're using a valid account? from an authentication standpoint. And those things sort of happen before you can even get to the provisioning aspects of the application. And not that it won't come in the future, but now that's more of a manual process in terms of setting those up. But typically, once those are configured and set up, you're really not going back and touching those configurations after that initial app creation. So that's what I typically say around those, because when you're setting this up, you're testing two sides to a coin, right? You have Okta set up, and then you have your SCIM piece, and so you're having confidence that, okay, I've selected and I've authenticated that endpoint, and that was successful. It brought back what configurations that SCIM service is going to allow. So now I can proceed on to the next steps of configuring the application for the correct provisioning required for that app. Damien, Praveen, any experiences on your side?
Yeah, I would echo Joe on that. So right now, so the API, the provisioning APIs for Okta are not available, but you can always customize using a custom Python script or JavaScript and spin up a headless browser and configure all the provisioning settings using that scripting. And yeah, we can definitely help you on that.
Okay, great, thank you. Next question, how do you migrate legacy apps to Okta? That's an easy one coming off the heels of the last one.
So legacy apps, they take on a lot of different connotations. So, what is it? Is it a COTS product, right? Is it something that I purchased years ago and still need? Is it a custom application that I built? So there's different things, and each one of them takes a slight different approach in terms of, how we're going to migrate it. I'll start with the custom apps. Custom apps, really the best thing to do would modernize them, right? Get OAuth or OIDC or even SAML built into the application directly, and then that can integrate with Okta pretty seamlessly, right? Where we can support those types of apps through configuration. If it's more of a COTS-based application, or maybe it's an older custom application that you have no intention of changing code. In those scenarios, what I would recommend is Okta Access Gateway. And so that's going to act as a reverse proxy in front of those applications and basically be able to do header translation to gain access to those applications. And in most cases, there is no modification to the app. You're just going to potentially configure the application slightly different. But OAG is going to do the heavy lifting of authenticating that user and then translating that into specific headers that application is looking. And when I say headers, I mean HTTP headers. Go ahead, Damon.
Sorry, Joe, I was just going to say something that can also be done for some legacy apps. If they're used to integrating with a directory, for example, as a user store, Okta can present itself as an LDAP directory to applications. With a user repository that basically pretends, hey, I'm an LDAP directory. And that's a way to get some legacy apps that are used to talking to LDAP and just point them at Okta, for example, as the LDAP directory.
Correct. Yeah, LDAP as a service is another great way to, migrate an app that you want to bring onto Okta.
Okay. Next question, any methods or best practices for pushing groups to and from AD?
Yeah, so I can take this one. So we have something called AD group filter that can be leveraged, and you can filter the groups that you want to import to Okta using the group filter. And if you are pushing the groups from Okta to AD, then you can use the group rules and you can assign the users to a particular group and push that group downstream to your Active Directory. Joe, would you like to add something, Joe?
Yeah, sure. Yes. So this is asking for best practices, right? So a lot of that starts up front in terms of what are your requirements. There's a lot of different reasons why you would do either pull from AD or to groups, and typically that's around some kind of access control. And so from a best practice perspective, Okta always recommends that you use groups as a way to protect access to applications. From a group push perspective to AD, that one leads to more of, well, why do you need to have Okta push groups into AD? And so my next questions on that one would be, why and when are those groups used, and what are they used for? And then that's going to sort of make that decision on, do I want to manage that level of groups within Okta and push those in? And so that could, be because, well, maybe the thing that's triggering the user to have access to a certain application, or maybe it's a certain distribution group or something that is in AD, but you're not controlling it in AD. It's something that's happening in Okta that makes that determination. And then that's when I would recommend looking at push groups to AD as a way to manage that and not have to have two separate processes for provisioning that level of access control.
Okay. Next question. Is there a case study from a customer that has moved away from eDirectory LDAP to Okta Universal Directory?
Yeah, so I worked with one of our customer, and they have around 80,000 user accounts. And so initially they were doing LDAP as a master, and after a while they have figured out, it's too much of a management, and they plan to move away from LDAP and wanted to migrate all the passwords from LDAP to Okta. And we had something called Okta OPP connector that captures all the passwords and pushes it downstream applications. And we captured all the passwords for a period of 3 months and re-imported all the password hashes back to Okta. And we migrated all from their LDAP to Okta. So it's a pretty successful project. And after the migration, there were no issues at all.
Yeah, and similar, I've had a few customers that have moved off LDAP, and most of those were performance concerns. Especially when you start getting into the millions of users, and migrating that user base to Okta, guarantees you, one, you don't have to run that level of infrastructure to handle, say, 1 million+ authentications a day. Because Okta is just going to handle that for you. And so you get the redundancy of being in the cloud, and then you can reduce your on-prem footprint in terms of your LDAP infrastructure. And ultimately, that's going to lead to some great performance gains and less downtime.
Great, thank you. Oh, I think I skipped one there, guys. There we go. Do you have any best practices? Certainly not for navigating Zoom, because I'm not one to give that. Do you have any best practices for integrating a VPN?
Yeah, so for integrating VPN, if the VPN provider supports SAML, we would definitely recommend going with SAML and using multi-factor along with SAML assertion. And if it is not supporting SAML, there is a Radius option as well. So you can install Radius agents on your data center and use multi-factor using the Radius agent. And if not, LDAP Okta also has a LDAP interface that can be integrated with any of your on-prem or cloud VPN services.
Yep, I'll ditto that. Always look at your VPN provider. If they do support, a modern auth such as SAML, highly recommend using that. And there's a lot of reasons why. One, typically an easier configuration. Two, you get the benefit of the Okta supporting all of our MFA factors. Radius doesn't include some of the options. So you get the benefit of having that. And then the other one that I always talk to customers about from a best practice perspective is if you move to a modern auth concept such as SAML, then that user login experience is consistent across not only access to VPN, but across to all the access that they have. And so you get a little bit of benefit there as well.
Next question. How does Okta provide secure MFA?
So I'll take that one. So you know, that's sort of a big open-ended question, because Okta obviously provides you know, multi-factor authentication, and there's a lot of different ways that you can configure based on your security requirements. We have customers that require MFA every login. We have ones that just want to log in per session. There's a lot of different things that you can think about when you look at how does Okta provide it. And one of the things that Okta does is it actually provides two different policies, is the way I like to look at it. The first policy is really around enrollment, right? So it's great to have MFA, but how do users actually enroll and get Google Authenticator or Okta Verify or YubiKey, you know, all the different factors that we support. There's this enrollment side. And one of the things that Okta is really good at is providing policies in terms of enrollment. So let's say you have a very sensitive application and you're going to require MFA. Okay, it's great, but now I need users to get enrolled. And one of the things that you can do is through enrollment policies, you can set up in such a way where you know, those high sensitive users that have access to this, you don't want them to have, say, open enrollment to go and enroll factors in a non-secure environment. And you can actually enforce enrollment to be in a network zone that you trust. And so they can only enroll into that factor once they are in that network. But then access can be provided outside of the network after enrollment. So now they'd be prompted with, say, a YubiKey to go through to the next step. And then that way you can sort of keep layering levels of security. And that can be done by user persona via policies and group management.
Sorry,
yeah, go ahead, Damian.
Okay. I just was going to say that also we can enforce MFA at the application level. So we can say, well, when you use this specific application, we require you to perform multi-factor authentication. And in addition to that, we now also, there's a new feature, SP-initiated step-up authentication. And what that means is that when we do trigger MFA for that specific application, we can actually direct the user to a custom login page. And what that means is that we can take them to a page where Okta then passes in that token that allows them to get a context of where they're at in terms of what factors they're being asked to authenticate with and where they're at in that flow. And it can really customize that step-up experience. So for example, to perform a certain transaction, it will take them to that custom page, explaining what's going on, and then sort of saying, well, and now you have to do this. This is why you're being asked, and this is your options to complete this. I also just quickly, when Joe was talking about policies, I think it's also worth mentioning that even if when configuring policies, MFA or any kind of policies like password policies, it's best practice to not create policies and keep them as for the group everyone, because down the track, that means that everyone's going to have the same policies. Even if you're only starting with customers and you say, well, I'm only ever going to have customers, one day you might not have customers. You might have customers and suppliers. And then all of a sudden, everyone is using the same policy and you've put yourself in a corner. So I always recommend to customers, even if you've got one group, well, what's the group called? Customers. That's the name of your group, and put all your policies under that. So.
And you can also enforce the policies based on the user behavior. And there is also something called factor sequencing, where you can implement password plus two-factor or more than one factor. And there are like multiple options that you can choose from Okta service policies.
Yeah, that's a good point. So behaviors is a whole nother concept within the policy management. So risk-based, geolocation, velocity, a lot of different options also in terms of how you would want to enforce your MFA security requirements.
Great, you guys. It's a very, very simple question with a tremendous amount of content behind it. That's good. I believe that was our last question. Do want to thank all the panelists. I know Joe and Praveen have had a full day, and Damian's just starting his day quite early. And apparently, to be a moderator or a panelist, you have to have little to no hair. I just noticed that as I'm looking through. Apparently, one of the criteria. Thank you all for everybody who's taking the time to listen to us here. Again, if we didn't get to your question, we can answer an email. A link to the recording here will be sent out 24 to 48 hours after the session has been recorded. So look for that as well. So thank you for your time and appreciate it. We'll see you next time around.